Hello, everybody, and welcome to the YWCA Dayton's Gem City Earth Tones. Welcome, everybody, to YWCA's YW Mission Moves presents Gem City Earth Tones. We're so glad to have you with us today as we talk about the intersections of race and health and the issues that arise within our community and how we must call out for the resolutions, for the support, for the navigation of these issues right here in our own community. YWCA Dayton has been around for quite some time and has been known as a domestic violence shelter and has been so much more. What we do at YWCA Dayton is stand in our mission, which is eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. We do this through a number of different programs, from our crisis care, our trauma and prevention care, our crisis response. We also have housing, we have shelter, we have programming for our youth. We also have programs for our adults within the community in the areas of entrepreneurship, as well as building themselves to build a better community. My name is Taylor Curtis, and I'm your host. Again, YWCA Dayton has been around for quite some time, and as we look at the issues that come right here within our own community, we have to recognize that those issues manifest not only physically, but also mentally and spiritually and emotionally. YWCA Dayton has specifically created an avenue for advocacy through this program where we're able to have live stream conversations that are not only live stream, but also live here at Gem City Market. As your host, I have to inform you that I am a psychologist. I was a psychology professor and a Black psychology professor, social psychology professor, studying international psychology. I did that for quite some time at St. Clair Community College, where I was tenured as the youngest Black female to receive tenure in the history of the United States of America. From there, I left that position to get hands-on within the community in the space of eliminating racism and empowering the community. In doing so, I was able to bring along not only my knowledge of psychology, but my knowledge of the issues here in the world that we live in today. In order to talk a little bit more about this, we're focusing today's conversation on silent cries, looking at mental health and domestic violence, the intersections of race and trauma and mental health issues and concerns, and how to get the help that we need here in the society that we live in. At this time, I want to give you just some background on the information, the experiences at hand, by looking at this video of Racism in America. This is about psychology's dialogue on race and health by the American Psychological Association.
In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line."
People in the crowd were ripping up a Confederate flag.
Over a century later, this problem persists. With the evolution of our media, we are now exposed to daily images documenting the perpetual struggle for equality by people of color in America.
this is the front lines of the war.
As a society, we need to talk about race, but to do so effectively, we need to understand racism's impact from a personal, societal, and scientific perspective.
And we got a long way to go until we feel equal.
We need to understand the toxic effects of race-related stress.
So, Dr. Jones, all else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? Well, the key phrase there is all else being equal. And all else hasn't been equal since 1865, and all else still is not equal today. And there are still what I describe as contemporary, present-day structural factors that are perpetuating each of these initial historical injustices.
I've been able to trace my mother's father's mother's family to Central Texas in the 1600s. Texas came to her family. She did not immigrate. Her family did not come here. And when we're told, go back home, what country do you come from? We don't want you here. It's like, let me push back just a little bit on that. What country do you come from? We don't want you here. It's like, let me push back just a little bit on that idea of yours.
I think that race-related stress are pressures and stressors that come about because of your race or ethnicity. And it could be external or it could be internal. By external, I mean from other groups. But I think sometimes people forget that race-related stress could come from within your own group as well.
But in terms of racial-related stress, this is a depth of identity that's being attacked. And because of that, it is a spiritual issue. And we have concerns about, how this can negatively impact people over time.
There are always these incidents of unjustified suffering, unmerited pain, and undeserved harm. The question is not, does shit happen to you in life? The question is, how do you sustain some movement and momentum in the face of that adversity?
We hope that this video inspires all of us to work to eradicate racial inequity so that we can finally solve the problem of the color line.
When we talk about racism in the United States of America, and then we talk about mental health, it's very obvious that the two indeed go hand in hand. When we talk about mental health, we're talking about your processes of how you think, your motivation, your emotions, your dreams, how you perceive your sensations and the things that you're interpreting from the world, and then also how it then impacts your behavior. That's the essence of psychology. And when we talk about mental health, we talk about how people are positioned in the world when it comes to how they think and how they perceive the world around them, and then how that influences their behavior. When we talk about mental health problems and conditions and disorders, we're often talking about a huge continuum that everybody functions on, although some people go and seek out professional help and maybe acquire some type of diagnosis. Most people go through different mental health issues throughout their life without any conversation about what that means, what it looks like, what it's called, how to define it, or how to process it and cope with it. When we talk about mental health issues, particularly in communities of color, and we look at the history of that, we can see that there were psychologists who made suggestions through Western psychology, because psychology was founded in Germany and later made its way to the United States, with a lot of European individuals who were at the lead and at the forefront. Unfortunately, a lot of the information that was shared across psychology was at the disdain and the demise of people of color. The conversations often suggested that people of color didn't have intelligence, people of color were inferior, people of color didn't have the type of brain or the same size brain or the same physical attributes that would constitute education, intelligence, and ability. There was the bell-shaped curve that normalized IQ ideas with testing that was differential to certain parties, where certain people had access to the information and to the wealth of knowledge and cultural experience that would provide them with the right answers, whereas others did not have that. And so at the end of it all, we saw that psychology played a very strong role in racism by perpetuating ideas that people of color were inferior intellectually, psychologically, emotionally, and physically. When we saw that, we start to see how Western and European psychologists start to frame the perspective of people of color. For example, there was that of the father of psychiatry, who was known for his racism. There was that of J. Marion Sims, who pried children's skulls open with a shoemaker's tool because he believed that Black children's brains weren't growing because of the skull that they had. When we start to look at other issues, we can see that there has been nothing but a cycle, and that cycle has been at the disadvantage of people of color. Not only is it a disadvantage because of the way that psychology is viewed, but also a disadvantage because of the experience that is not acknowledged of what people of color go through here in this country. A lot of people came here through many different ways, from slavery to seeking refuge to just seeking a new life. And in those different experiences, there are many things that happen that culture and society does to an individual that produce trauma. Today, we're going to talk about how that trauma shows up and a little bit more about what this looks like. We are going to have a wonderful guest speak with us today. Her name is Ashley Wormley. She is a licensed professional clinical counselor, and she is here in the state of Ohio, particularly in the Dayton area, working with children, families, teens, and adults. She specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, narrative therapy techniques, solution-focused techniques, and mindfulness techniques. She uses her skills to help clients develop and learn coping skills through their natural language. Ashley also considers herself as a multicultural counselor, taking pride in her love and acceptance of differences. Through past work experience as a school therapist, MRDD caretaker, substance abuse and mental health therapist, and ER counselor and therapist, she has had an abundant amount of trauma experience, and we're very grateful that she is here with us today to talk about what that experience might look like here in the community of the Gem City. Welcome, Ashley.
Hi, Taylor. Thanks for having me.
We're so glad that you could be here and that we could have this really organic conversation, because I think that when people talk about mental health, a lot of times they are burdened by these false ideas and these misconceptions and these myths that are swirling around, especially on social media.
Yes.
What are some of the myths that you hear when people come to you to talk about mental health and what that looks like?
Okay, so within the last year, I've opened up my own private practice geared towards the Black community and wanting to ensure that people of color have somebody that looks like them, that they can talk to about just some of the struggles that they are experiencing. And over the years, I have come into contact with people believing that because they're Black, there is no such thing as mental health. There is no such thing as I'm struggling with depression or anxiety, just go pray it off or go to church and talk to God about it. We also have this misconception of what stays in the house, or whatever goes on in the house stays in the house. So that just incorporates and just continues that trauma.
Right.
A lot of times we see people being abused in the home, but they can't tell anybody because what goes on in the house has to stay there.
Right. And I feel like that's the conversation I hear the most. Like, that's not for us.
Right.
Like seeking mental health professionals, or
just going out and talking
like,
in general about whatever you're struggling with.
It's just not for us.
Right.
Like, this is something, like, it's unheard of almost. Like, this is something that's taboo. Like, you're not supposed to do it. If you do it, you're weird.
Right.
You're out of order. You're doing things contrary to our culture. Like, you know, it's just weird that people, I don't know why people have come to this conclusion. What do you think has been the driving factor that have led people to believe that?
So I personally believe that slavery in and of itself has led us to believe that ultimately we're inferior. So we don't have a mental health because we are so headstrong on, I have to do this by myself because nobody else is going to understand me. So from the start of slavery even till now, we've never sought out anybody who doesn't look like us to talk about things that we struggle with because we are afraid that they're not going to understand our perspective.
And that's crazy to me because as a professor, right, as a Black Studies professor especially, I've had numerous white students, Asian students, Latinx students of all kinds of backgrounds that take the classes that have an understanding of cultural competency, understanding that they're aware of how they view difference, they're aware of how they view the world, and they're also willing to acknowledge the needs of difference, the needs of culture, and then have the cultural humility to be able to say, you know what, I don't understand. I have never walked in your shoes, but I trust you to share your own narrative, and then the cultural respect to then say, okay, how do I support you in that?
Right.
And support
But
you
it's
in your
easier
walk.
for other cultures to have that cultural mentality other than us because all we know is us. All we've ever seen was us.
True.
So it's kind of hard for us to even let people, even of other minorities, come into our circle because we don't trust them. We don't trust their perspective because they might have been brainwashed or might have gone through their own struggles with, again, if you go back to slavery with the white people or whatever. So they just don't understand our perspective because we were in it for so long and we're still being judged or we're still going through some things that we view these other people, even though they're minorities, that they don't connect with us in our experiences.
Right. And I guess I feel that after having a therapist myself, because most of us psychologists do.
If your therapist doesn't have a therapist, something's wrong.
Something's wrong. Don't go there. Okay. But what I've noticed with my therapist and my experience in therapy is that having somebody who has a different walk of life is almost better for me. Now, mind you, my therapist and the difference we have is a gender identity difference. My therapist is male, identifies as male. I identify as female. My pronouns are she, hers.
Right.
So when we have conversation, I get to see a totally different perspective because I'm hearing from the male identifying side and in ways that I absolutely do not process because I believe that we process very, very differently.
Most definitely.
So I think that in my experience, what I would say is that having someone of a different walk can only enhance your experience, not necessarily create more barriers. Now, I will say there's value in finding someone who has walked and shared some cultural experience because there is a level of cultural competency that can't be achieved by someone who has not had any experience whatsoever. What do you think about the myth that there are no people of color in the mental health professionals field?
Well, as you can see, we're contrary to that belief.
Right.
Just because we are not only psychologists and counselors in this field, but the more that you actually take a look and the more that you actually try to research, you'll see that there is a wide variety of providers out there. Not only Black providers, not only white providers, but there's Asian, Latino, LGBTQ providers. Like there's so many different providers now. And I think, and let's be honest, COVID has helped with bringing that to the forefront that there is a mental health for people of all colors,
right?
For people of all races, genders, identities, or whatever. So people are starting to seek that out.
Yeah.
So more providers are coming out.
Yes, and I think I noticed that with the telehealth movement that's taking place, especially during COVID, that brings a lot more opportunities to the table locally because I did feel that I couldn't find who I was looking for, who had the specialty in what I needed to talk about here in the city. Like I was struggling for a minute before COVID hit, and then it seems like I dropped it. I didn't revisit it for a while, and then after COVID hit and I revisited it, boom, there's just all kinds of providers everywhere.
Right.
What is the process to finding a provider to help you with your mental health?
So there's a wide variety of ways that you can find a provider. You can try to go and look on your own. And if you're doing it on your own, I would use like Psychology Today, especially if you're looking for a therapist of color. Black women in therapy or Black men in therapy are two of the great resources. But if you are not sure where to look on your own, don't have access to computers or that kind of thing, just ask your doctor and tell them that you are wanting a referral for a therapist, and they have connections within themselves or within their network that they can send out a referral to. Once you find that provider, all you really do is call them up like you're making a regular doctor's appointment. Schedule that appointment, and they'll have you do what we call consent forms and background information and all of that. And then your first session is a Q&A type of thing. So you're sitting there just answering a bunch of questions about things you've been through, any trauma history, suicidal thoughts, any struggles you're currently having, so that way you and that therapist can develop what we call a treatment plan. Mm-hmm. And from that treatment plan will determine what your sessions look like from there.
I feel like another resource that people don't use is their insurance if they have it.
Yes.
Because you can call your insurance provider and ask them to just send you a list. And they will literally send you a full-blown list of every provider that is covered under your insurance.
That are within a specific radius of where you live.
Yeah. And now, for people like me, if you're the type of person who's a little indecisive, it can be really intimidating and overwhelming, because you'll realize how many people exist in the area that you could be seeing and could be talking to.
Right.
When it comes to people that you've seen and the experiences that you've had, what are some of the disorders that you see the most, especially in communities of color?
The biggest thing that we're seeing right now with communities of color are severe depression, severe anxiety, and even what we call bipolar disorder. So bipolar disorder, the reason why it is different from depression is because you have spurts or these moments where you are what they consider manic. And mania can look different in each person. So there's hypomania and then mania. Hypomania is just the less severe form of mania, but mania is where you're not sleeping for days at a time, but you have so much energy that you feel like you can conquer the world. You have this grandiose thinking that I'm Superwoman or I'm Superman and I can do anything under the sun, as well as some other characteristics. But those are the three main things that we're seeing right now, especially in the midst of COVID, with regards to the Black community.
And that's not surprising, because when I think about from a Black psychology perspective, and I think about the history of enslavement, and I think about the different things that this particular group of people experienced over the years, it went from life or death by way of extreme abuse, extreme violence, watching people be lynched and murdered around you, watching people be hung around you, watching people be put into torture chambers around you, mutilated, buck breaking, where Black men were raped, and in front of their families, in front of their children, in front of the other adults. The type of trauma that those experiences created, and the things that people learned as a trauma response, right? Like the idea of cleaning.
Yes.
For women,
especially
Black women, right? Under enslavement, if you didn't do these jobs and tasks absolutely perfectly, that was a risk to your life, your health, your safety, and your family. Because you could be sold and sent somewhere totally different.
And not only that, but you had the risk of them taking their frustrations out on you, or even taking it out on your children.
Right. And I feel like that then to the next generations, where now individuals are free from slavery, yet the only jobs available because of racism, because of white supremacy, because of segregation, is domestic jobs and domestic availabilities, where you still have this task of cleaning and upkeeping of the house, nurturing the children, taking care of all these things. And then if you don't do this, you can't sustain your family, because single motherhood and single women was a thing, because the men were often sent to other jobs like mining, railroads, and other things far, far away from their families, not able to be in the household. So you have women who are sustaining for their families only through things like cleaning.
Right.
And then we wonder why there's such a hold on Black women today, where if their house isn't clean, they feel like they're failing.
Right.
That's like a perfect example of post-traumatic slave syndrome.
Yes.
Right? what are other ways that sometimes anxiety and depression and other mental health disorders and trauma show up, especially for people of color?
So one thing that I'm really noticing, especially with some of my outpatient clients in private practice, is having what we call high functioning anxiety or high functioning depression, which means that you feel anxious, depressed every moment of every day, but you're still being what society would consider productive. So you feel sad, you feel anxious, like you feel on edge, like something's out of your control, but you're still making it throughout the day and being, again, productive. You're going to work, you're taking care of your kids, you're taking care of yourself, but on the inside, you don't feel right. So a lot of times we see this show up as being overly productive. So you have this growing to-do list that you are constantly adding to because
get off my toes, okay? Get off of my toes.
I'm stepping on my own toes as we speak. But we have this growing to-do list because if we're not productive, we're not anything.
Yeah.
And if we don't get this to-do list done, not only are we anxious about getting the to-do list done, but when we don't do something on this to-do list, we're even more anxious.
True.
So we just have what we call high functioning anxiety. We're functioning as if somebody who is having anxiety, but we're doing things as we should be doing them.
Right. That is definitely how it shows up for me.
Same. That's why I said I'm stepping on my own toes.
And I think too, there are other things that show up that we just never been able to put a name to. So when we've never put a name to it, never been educated on how to see it within ourselves, we just take it as normal, even though it's not. And I feel like that's the case with a lot of trauma and trauma experiences and trauma responses, that we experience it as normal, even though it's not.
Yes.
I think about relationships and how in relationships we see trauma and trauma responses and re-triggering of trauma take place across.
But let's talk about what trauma is, because a lot of times people don't know that they're in a traumatic experience.
Come on.
So a lot of times if you're in a relationship, let's talk on relationships. If you're in a relationship where you're constantly being yelled at, or if you're constantly being told, I don't like what you're wearing, that's trauma. Especially because that person is, lo and behold, trying to control you in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
So if that continues, you're experiencing a traumatic event.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times we think of trauma as sexual abuse, physical abuse, but there's other forms.
Yeah.
There's financial abuse.
Yeah.
There's verbal abuse.
Yeah.
There's things where people are attacking you and attacking your character and how you look and basically putting you down so that way they can mold you into what they would want you to be.
Absolutely.
Those are traumatic experiences. And a lot of times we don't recognize that as trauma because that's all we've ever known.
And when trauma is compounded upon itself over and over and over again, it becomes our norm.
Exactly.
For example, racial trauma. When we see and hear and experience different instances of racism, whether it's our own direct experience or whether it's indirectly, we experience trauma as a result of that.
Right.
Where it's this negative feeling, we have this negative thinking, and we get put into survival mode each and every time.
Right.
And in that space and in that place, we tend to see people develop chronic stress, where they have migraines, headaches, gastrointestinal problems,
Can't eat or sleep.
Yep. And then they go into the other aspects that we then start to define in these disorders that we see all the time. I think there are some disorders, even from a Black psychology perspective, that exist that no one knows about. Like
post-traumatic slave syndrome.
Or like menticide, where we are now going to kill the mind and kill the mind of a people, kill the mind of a community through messaging, through movies, through videos, through social media, through all of these different things that lead you to believe that you are different than what you are, or lead you down a false narrative about your culture, like the narrative of slavery being the starting point for history rather than the history of the origin of man and the origin of mathematics and chemistry and science and kings and queens and emperors and all the things that took place in Africa before anyone migrated out of it, right? Or anyone was forced out of there. And then I think about misorientation, because when you kill the community's perspective of self by the very messages that children are given as they're growing up, then you misorient them to a new culture. You cause them to assimilate to a new culture and to be aligned with something that doesn't align with their benefit and their survival, but actually their detriment.
Mhm.
And then in that process, you start to see different things bubble up, like post-traumatic slave syndrome. You see mammyism, where women are expected to be the nurturers and
the caretakers.
Or you see this hypersexualization of women of color, or you see this adultification of men and women of color, boys and girls that are treated like they're adults from very young ages. Like, all of these things are things that we see and things that we witness when we look at the different concerns that we see within mental health. What would be your advice to someone who is dealing with trauma or dealing with any mental health issues, anxiety, depression? Their house is, the walls are closing in on them, or because their house is dirty, or they're experiencing these negative things that they're not sure why they're feeling the way that they are, but they just know they're feeling it. What's your advice?
So my advice is always going to be find a therapist. Find somebody that you connect with and talk to them about some of the things that you're experiencing. It doesn't necessarily have to be a clinician of color. Just really find somebody that you mesh with, that can understand your perspective and be upfront and honest with them. However, if you're on the other side of that spectrum, where you are currently having thoughts of self-harm, having thoughts of harming other people, or even struggling with having what we call hallucinations, hearing voices or seeing things that may or may not be there, immediately seek an emergency treatment. Go to the hospital, get what we call a crisis assessment, and allow them to help you decide if you need to be inpatient or if you can go home with resources. Now, there's nothing wrong with being inpatient. It just means that you are in a crisis setting and you need immediate help. It's almost as if like you broke your toe and needed to go to the hospital.
Right.
It's literally the same type of a process. You're in an inpatient setting for medical and mental health. So it really just depends on what side of that spectrum you're on. If you're not in that crisis mode, then do some of those things we talked about before of trying to find that therapist and somebody you mesh well with. But again, if you're on that crisis setting or in that crisis mode, seek immediate attention through going to your local emergency department.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for sharing your experience and sharing your knowledge and your expertise. And we have more to hear from Ashley on the panel. We have a conversation a little bit later talking about what this really, really looks like for each one of us individually. At this time, we're going to go into our commercial break, and we'll be back with you in a few seconds. Every day, a female identifying person misses out on opportunity. And every day, a female identifying person of color misses out on even more opportunities. That's why eliminating racism and empowering women is so important. YWCA Dayton is doing this specifically through a program called Women's Empowerment 360. We 360 is a program for marginalized female identifying people to have access to entrepreneurship business training, entrepreneurship business coaches, and networks of other entrepreneurs. This global networking platform usually costs about $500 for individuals to participate in. YWCA Dayton is offering it to you for free. All you have to do is reach out to ywcadayton.org and find the We360 program, Women's Empowerment 360. Or you can email us at advocacy.ywcadayton.org. If you contact us, we can get you started on your journey of entrepreneurship so that you can build a business that not only builds your legacy, but also builds the bridge between the racial wealth gap that exists right here in our community. We hope that you become a part of our tribe. Join us with the cohort of the fall for Women's Empowerment 360. Welcome back to Gym City Earth Tones. I'm your host, Taylor Curtis, Advocacy Manager at YWCA Dayton, and we are here today with Maddie DeVivo. Maddie is our YWCA Rural Prevention Educator for YWCA Dayton. Maddie graduated from Miami University of Ohio with a BA in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and minors in Arabic and Family Studies. She's currently employed at the YWCA Dayton as the Rural Prevention Educator, engaging youth, educators, community partners, first responders, and more in prevention programming. Maddie believes that true prevention starts with the early, comprehensive, and LGBTQ+ inclusive sex education, and is responsible for the implementation of the Preble County Shift Peer Education Program, where local high school seniors are trained to become facilitators of prevention programming in their own schools. In the future, Maddie plans to earn her Master's of Social Work and Sex Educator credentials and continue engaging at-risk populations in sexual violence prevention. Welcome, Maddie.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. We're very, very excited that you're here with us today. And we know that you have a lot to share with us in regards to trauma.
Yes.
Don't worry, I got you.
First slide. Yes. So.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so Ashley briefly mentioned domestic violence, relationship violence, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. There we go. Briefly, a little bit more about that and how that impacts us and how that relates to trauma. So intimate partner violence is the umbrella term for dating and domestic violence. Both are very similar, the only difference being the dynamic of the relationship. Are you dating? Do you have a child in common? Do you reside together? So intimate partner violence is any act of abuse or aggression intended to remove power and control away from one partner. So this can manifest in a couple of different ways, including physical violence, anything such as hitting, kicking, even slamming doors, cabinets near someone's physical space that can be taken as threatening. Of course, sexual violence, any sexual act that's non-consensual or that occurs where consent cannot be given. So if someone's under the influence of alcohol or another substance, or even sexual acts that occur without consent when folks are not physically together. So forcibly texting or revenge porn, so the illegal sending out of someone's explicit photos without their consent, that's called revenge porn. Stalking is any behavior that, again, seeks to cause someone to feel threatened or fear for their safety, such as tracking their location. When I was a victim advocate in my former career, and something we see a lot of is perpetrators calling their partner's jobs over and over and over to check up on them throughout the day. So that's a very common form of stalking. And then you have psychological aggression. So that covers any verbal and non-verbal form of aggression that, again, is meant to assert control and power over their partner. So demeaning names, gaslighting, like Ashley mentioned, belittling your clothing, belittling how you speak, the way you talk, anything that caused them to feel down about themselves, or again, to cause them to feel unsafe in their own home. Those are some of the broader topics of intimate partner violence, and then those are enforced through various tactics, such as the use of children and pets. This is a very common one. Pets are often used to show physical violence. If you harm a pet, it's not a huge jump to harm a child or to harm your partner, right? So pets are often used, and physical violence is often enacted against pets and children to show that they mean business, right? Children are often used also. We'll have partners that threaten to call CPS on their partner, especially if they don't share a home together. They'll say, well, if you don't show up tomorrow, I'm going to call CPS on you. And particularly for marginalized communities, that is a very real threat. That is, to have a sheriff's deputy or a social worker show up at your house, even if you're the greatest parent in the world, that is a very scary threat to have someone in a uniform show up at your door unexpected. So if you have someone threatening that, it's very normal and appropriate to change your behavior to align to what they're telling you to do. Coercion and threats are very common.
Demanding behaviors, displaying any sort of weapon is very common, especially now because the use of handguns is so normalized in our community. So, and they're just so accessible. So even just displaying that or mentioning that, the perpetrator mentioning that they have access to a handgun, that will get folks to change their behaviors.
Definitely.
And then use of privilege is one I particularly want to talk about, of course. So for every, there's no relationship dynamic that is 100% equal, even though we wish it could be, right? So if a white partner is perpetrating against, and if their partner is a Black woman, they will use that against them. Same if their partner is in a wheelchair, they will restrict access to their mobility device, and that's a form of able-bodied privilege. They will restrict access to their mobility device, access to their medications, or they will make the house more challenging so that the person in the mobility device cannot access the bathroom or their kitchen to get those basic needs met, and that's a form of able-bodied privilege, of course. Or again, threatening to call the police if that person is if that person is an immigrant, or if they're non-native English speaking, or if if they are using a substance. That is a huge one. That invisible disability of addiction. You're going to change your behavior to fit the mold of what your perpetrator is asking you to do if they're using that privilege against you. Straight privilege is the same way. If your partner is threatening to out you to your family, to your friends, to your job, because there's no comprehensive housing or job protections in the state of Ohio, there's no safety if your partner kicks you out and your family is not a safe place for you to go. So any form of privilege, of course, can be used against any marginalized community. So those are huge. That's a huge tactic that's often used in every relationship. And then isolation is also key. It can be something small like having your partner cancel dates, cancel girls' night, cancel after work drinks because you want to spend more time with them. And at first it sounds sweet, right? It sounds a little romantic, but the next thing you know, you have no social outlet. You've got, no one to confide in once the abuse starts to amp up. Maybe long-term you quit your job and now you're financially dependent on your perpetrator. Maybe they even move you to a different state. So now you've got no friends, no family, no social or community outlets, and you're totally bound to them. So isolation is a very common tactic of control.
Yeah.
And then the effect that domestic violence has on a person is what we call trauma. So trauma is simply an adaptation to a life-altering event. It is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. Trauma occurs, like Ashley said, in any situation. Our first understanding of trauma came after the war, and PTSD was first called shell shock. And at first we thought PTSD could only apply to survivors of war, to veterans of war. And then we began to understand just how traumatic everyday life can be, right? With car accidents, with gun violence, school shootings, racial and generational trauma, assaults in the home. Anyone can experience a traumatic event at any point in their day. So we really began to understand just how large and profound trauma is just in our general communities. And then we began to look even closer at the science behind trauma, and we found that there is a neurobiological explanation for trauma. And we can see, this is a pretty general depiction of the brain, but what we know is that our brain develops, it starts in gestation, but our brain continues to develop a few years after we're born. But we start by developing the brain stem, which is just our basic functioning. It's what keeps our heart pumping when we're sleeping. It's what tells us to keep breathing overnight, basic functioning. And then our midbrain forms, and this is our survival mode. This is where we go into survival mode, like Ashley was talking about. Next, we have the limbic system, which regulates our feelings and emotions. And finally, the cortex, or more specifically, our prefrontal cortex, is what houses our executive functions and reasoning. So our critical thinking skills are housed in our prefrontal cortex. And what happens during a traumatic event is our body signals to our brain to shut down that prefrontal cortex. And then we go into survival mode out of our midbrain. So we lose all sense of critical thinking skills when we're experiencing a traumatic event. And for someone that's living in a traumatic event, say a child experiencing child abuse, or a person of color experiencing racial injustice in their community, or a woman experiencing domestic violence in her own home, that trauma brain never turns off. They're always on edge, they're always on alert. And that's when we start to see symptoms like Ashley was talking about. You see depression, anxiety, what we call hyperarousal, so a state of constant alertness. Maybe someone that's always on edge or very jumpy, someone that, jumps at every car door slam. That's called hyperarousal. You start to see PTSD is sort of an overarching term for all of those symptoms combined. But then we see maladaptive behaviors for folks that are trying to cope with all of these negative emotions that they're experiencing. When you're in survival brain, you're functioning with very basic thinking skills. Again, you don't have those critical thinking skills that tell you this is right and this is wrong. You're doing the best you can. And that's where we start to see folks engaging in substance abuse, high-risk sex, alcohol addiction, other maladaptive behaviors, eating disorders, suicidality, things like that. So while they're not healthy coping skills, they're coping skills nonetheless.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is just so much information that we need to have and that we don't have enough, because I think trauma is one of those things that people don't ever talk about. But I see all of those things that you mentioned happening all of the time. And so I guess this is a great time for us to have our moment of pressure, okay? Our moment of pressure. So stay tuned for our moment of pressure. Here is the moment. There is a question of the day when it comes to pressure, okay? Our moment of pressure is just simply acknowledging that a diamond is merely a lump of coal that did well under pressure. And so we all go through trauma, we all go through pressure, we all go through different things, and yet how we deal with it is what determines whether or not we'll remain a lump of coal or whether we'll become a diamond. So I want to turn this question to our panel and to the audience. Please feel free to drop an answer in the comments. If you have an answer in the comments, how does trauma show up for you?
So for me personally, I have, like you were saying, maladaptive coping skills and positive coping skills, and how that shows up for me when it comes to trauma. So for me, like we were talking about before, like having this growing to-do list, and adding things to this to-do list is my maladaptive coping skill towards my trauma. However, I will also sleep. I will sometimes overeat or eat the wrong things when I know I should be doing other things. However, more recently, I have acknowledged that I'm maladaptive. I am not coping the way that I should be. So I end up talking to my therapist. I talk to my psychiatrist, or I just talk to those close friends and family that I can trust, that I know won't judge me, who understand what I'm going through, and just be able to vent like, sis, this is what I'm going through today.
Right.
So those are how trauma shows up for me, and that's how I cope with it.
For me, my trauma brain is definitely fight. So I get very irritable and I lash out. Sometimes I panic and I sweat, hyperventilating. Panic attacks are very common for trauma survivors, and I've survived quite a bit. But fortunately, I've been able to turn that into this. So I guess it worked out.
Diamond, she tried it. For me, I guess it does show up in a lot of both ways. I know for a fact that I am very hypervigilant about, especially when it comes to racial trauma. I was pulled over by the police last week. I wasn't pulled over, but a black male was driving, and I was in the passenger seat, and all I could see and think was Philando Castile. I have a CCW, so all I could see and think was Philando Castile and how he was murdered, even though he was cooperating and complying and doing everything that he was supposed to do. And that was just like, I was through the roof. And anytime I see encounters like that or have experiences with police, I always feel that like
Hyperarousal.
Hyperarousal. A panic attack might come on. Like, I've had panic attacks. I'm an asthmatic, so that makes it worse.
Even worse.
I definitely have the growing to-do list and the overworking myself and over productivity where I think I'm being productive, but in reality, I'm just anxious. And to deal with it, awareness is key for me. So like having those moments and then going, this is anxiety, is so important for me, because when I can identify it, I have some other mental health disorders and things too. And so when I can identify it, be like, put two and two together and go, oh, that's what's happening right now. Mm-hmm. It's almost as if the switch clicks and then I'm able to deal with it a lot better. Mm-hmm. Or sometimes the switch doesn't click till after I've already started being maladaptive. And then I go, you're like, oh, okay.
That's what I was doing for the last 3 weeks.
Right. Like, oh, that's why I was acting that way, or that's why I was feeling like that. I don't sleep at night, and I've had a lot of trouble sleeping. Mm-hmm. And I've noticed that I have more trouble sleeping and more insomnia when I'm dealing with a racially traumatic situation, mm-hmm. or dealing with more abuse, trauma, mm-hmm. or dealing with those types of things. I also find like triggers pop up that I had no idea I had. And so when I started doing martial arts, after having an experience of abusive relationship, and then getting into a position, because my abusive relationship wasn't physically like fighting like a lot of people think abuse is. Like you said, it comes in many different ways. It's all about power and control. So when I got into sparring situations that were organized, strategic, everybody's got pads on, and we're doing things that we're supposed to do, the fact that there were moments where I lost control, where I didn't have control of what was going to happen next, would be the moments that I got triggered, and the moments PTSD would come back, and now I'm balled up on the floor somewhere crying. Like, seriously. And so learning to deal with that has a huge part with being aware of triggers, and then a huge part of talking to someone, like you said, and seeking the help, and then finding ways to then channel that energy, because you have to replace it with something. You can't just talk it out. You have to replace that energy with something else. You have to redirect that energy. It has to come in some sort of way. So leave us a comment. Let us know how trauma shows up for you and what you do about it, because it's very important that we acknowledge the trauma that we have, because we all have it, and then that we also acknowledge how to deal with it so that we can deal with it in a healthy way. So for the panel, another question I had is, what are the signs that indicate you need to seek help?
Are you referring to us personally, or
someone in general? So if someone in the audience was listening, what are the signs that would be like, you need to seek help? And this could go for mental health. This could go for domestic violence. This is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And as you've broken down how trauma relates and how trauma shows up, especially in cycles of domestic violence, I think that's a really great question to ask as well. What are your thoughts?
So when you start to notice that when others start to notice that your behavior is changing, that is a huge key indicator, especially for youth in schools. Behavior is a key indicator. So if you notice you're coping in different ways, maybe you're drinking more frequently, or you picked smoking back up, or you're more irritable than you normally are, or you're not eating as much, or you're eating way normal, something's off with your behavior, that's a huge indicator, because a lot of times we don't realize what's going on mentally until we talk it out, until we research, until we seek a therapist's help and they say that's what that is. But a lot of times our behavior shows us what's going on more so than our thoughts and our thinking do. So I say when your behavior starts to change, that's a really good indicator.
I would definitely agree. And like you said earlier, if people are telling you that your behavior is changing, mm-hmm. or even you start to notice that you're doing things differently. So if you were once, Susie Homemaker, and you kept your house nice and clean and tidy, and then next thing you know, you wake up and you have zero energy or motivation to clean it, and it's the laundry's piling up, the dishes are piling up, or you just are not taking care of yourself and or your home, that could be a clear indicator that something is wrong. But a lot of times we see it more behaviorally before we even recognize it mentally or emotionally. But if you take that step back and even just think about how you've been feeling, say for like the last week, if you are not as happy or as calm as you used to be, that could also be an indicator that something is wrong. It might not necessarily be a mental health issue, but there's something going on within that week that has changed your behavior.
That's really good. Watching for those behavior changes, watching for how other people see you show up. I think that's a big one that I think is missed, because I think sometimes we feel that we know ourselves so well that other people can't tell us.
You can't tell me who I am.
You can't tell me who I am. How dare you, Maddie? You can't tell me what's what. I know me. Right. But I think that other people do notice when that behavior shifts, when your attitude changes, when your conversation changes, when your tone changes. I think in terms of domestic violence, one of the spaces that I often see is, like you said, that isolation piece takes place. And when your people start saying, hey, you're not around anymore, that is a huge red flag for you, because if you're not engaging in the same behaviors, and I'm not saying go party with your friends every weekend, or, hang out with your girls every day, or anything like that. But when other people start to notice that, that is a huge piece. Because I had that experience of, oh, I had plans for us tonight. You're really going to go do that? I was going to surprise you. And I'm like, oh, how thoughtful. When in reality, that is not what you're doing. That's not what the intentions are. What are other signs that would indicate that this is abuse?
So many. Again, abuse is about power and control. So if you are suddenly not in control anymore of your finances, of your time, of what you eat, what you wear, or even before that, if you realize people are calling into question your own control, your own autonomy, like Ashley said, what are you wearing? I don't like the way you dress. I don't like the way you talk. I don't like how much you hang out with your friends. This is who I am. This is what makes me me. Unless like you said, you're going out partying and drinking every single night, there's no reason to change who you are for one person. So again, people calling into question your own control of your own body and your own person and your own reactions and your own life, that is a red flag. Abuse rarely starts out aggressive and physical. It starts out psychological, and it starts out small with little instances of them inserting themselves into your life to take away power, and then it builds. It doesn't start out with a punch on the first date. So it's those small red flags very early on. Again, like you said, sometimes friends and family will notice them before you do. So listening to your peers, listening to your friends, because early on, so those little warning bells, they're probably right.
And what about with suicide and suicidal ideation? I guess I'll pose this to you, Ashley. I think some of our viewers may be hearing this, and they may have had moments where they feel that they're not worth it, or know somebody else who has had that feeling. What do you do when you know someone who is having thoughts of suicide, or when you yourself are having thoughts of suicide?
So if you yourself are having those thoughts of suicide, that's what we were talking about before, immediately seeking out an emergency care, because you know yourself better than anybody else. So if you are sitting here having thoughts of, I want to kill myself, there's nothing for me to live for, and you develop an actual plan on how you're going to follow through with those thoughts, seek immediate help. But if you have people coming to you and talking to you, telling you that, I'm not feeling like myself, or I'm having thoughts of not wanting to be here anymore, try to keep them on the phone and keep them talking as much as possible. Try to see if you can get to not necessarily the root of their issue, but see if you guys can, quote unquote, keep each other safe. And if not, try to text or call or somehow get the police officers over to their house, if you know their address and their location, to do what we call a well check. And again, it's not to say that there's something wrong with them or to make it seem like a negative connotation. You are literally just making sure that they're safe. And if you are their friend or you're their family, that's what you want to see. You want to see them happy. You want to see them safe. So send an officer to their house if you cannot get them to the hospital yourself.
Thank you both for all of your insight and sharing this information, because I really feel like these are the type of conversations that our community needs to have more and more often, so that we can keep one another safe and that we can build our earth tones to say celebrate rather than to suffer. right? And so thank you all for joining Gem City Earth Tones. YW Mission Moves is happy to bring this series live to the Gem City market every fourth Monday of the month. We're excited to come back next month. Feel free to join us in person or tune in again online. And we hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you again, and good night.